So my name is Becky Gonzalez. I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Iowa in Spanish and Portuguese and Linguistics. And I am very excited to introduce Dr. Aris Clemons, our next speaker. She's an assistant professor of Hispanic linguistics in the Modern Foreign Languages and Literatures Department at UT Knoxville. She has a BA in Spanish and Political Science from Cal State Fullerton, MAs in Linguistics, Sociolinguistics, and Foreign Language Teaching, and TESOL from Syracuse, and a PhD in Hispanic Linguistics and Mexican American and Latino Studies from UT Austin. She has extensive experience as a language teacher, both in the US and abroad. She also has experience in education administration. So all these experiences have shaped her transdisciplinary vision, which you'll hear about in her talk. Her work integrates ideas from multiple fields, including linguistics, education, anthropology, and Black and Latino studies. Her work has been published in journals like Latino Studies, Postcolonial Linguistics, and the Journal of Spanish Language Teaching. And most recently, she was awarded a very prestigious American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Aris Clemons.
Thank you. Thank you, Becky, for the introduction. And really thank you everyone who's here and everyone who made this day possible, this symposium possible. It's really been generative, and the conversations that I'll have today are really going to be kind of like an extension of what's been talked about in the last day and a half and what will continue to be talked about, I'm sure. So I'm going to do some reading because otherwise I speak really, really fast, or I will just drone on for a long, long time. So if you see me, hopefully I'll be able to like interject and do some other things, but I'm going to start out by reading. So I'm really excited to be here to share some notes with you all about some ongoing collaborative work that I'm doing with a rather large group of language and linguistic scholars. So these are people that are not only linguists, but who also do speech and language pathology, educational linguistics, and these other fields. And so the current presentation that's entitled Apolitical Linguistics Doesn't Exist and It Shouldn't, Setting the Framework for Liberatory Linguistics, comes from a chapter that will be published in one of two upcoming Oxford volumes entitled Decolonizing Linguistics and Increasing Inclusion in Linguistics, respectively. So while I will not lay out the entirety of the models presented in the volume due to time constraints, I wanted to spend some time speaking about why this large group of scholars and others are calling for decolonial models, and then I'm going to provide an example of how I apply the principles that are being developed by these scholars in my own linguistic research. Nope. It's not working. It works now. Okay. So before I get started, I'm gonna begin by briefly speaking about myself. And I apologize to whoever's in this room that may have already heard parts of this. But I believe it's really important to be transparent about your own positionalities when presenting language research. And this is a practice that my colleagues and I have been advocating for when studying languages, especially minority languages. By stating one's positionality in relation to their research populations, choices about research questions, theoretical frames, and ultimately interpretations become clearer. So I'm originally from the Bay Area, all over the Bay Area in California, and I spent much of my formative years watching my grandmother and her activist colleagues defend the rights of African-American language and what would lead up to the Oakland Ebonics debates of the 1990s, even though at the time I had no idea they were linguists and that there was a name for that job. I was sent to an independent African-American Montessori school where instruction happened in English, French, and Swahili. My father's African-American, and my mother was born in a small Caribbean island called Martinique, where the language spoken there is French. It's still a French island. So I was raised around this kind of Black diaspora consisting of African-Americans, West Indians, and recent African migrants. And these coalitions around which I was formed grounded me both in a passion for language diversity. So it was a lot of Black people who were speaking several different languages, as well as for Black liberatory struggle. So at 19, I decided to continue my studies in Spain after becoming conversational in Spanish after a 3-month abroad trip. And I can talk about why I had to go to Spain to finish my studies if anybody's interested in that later. While I was in Madrid, I was frequently re-ethnicized as Dominican. And this was owing to the fact that it was very clear to many, I had big curly hair with loose curls. It was very clear to many that I wasn't the sub-Saharan African that they had encountered in that space before, nor was I American and what they had imagined as like a United Statesian, which at that point was like an exchange student that may be from Middle America, blonde, blue eyes, that kind of exchange student. So when people saw me, what they saw was a Black Latina. I was mostly ethnicized as a Dominican, but every once in a while I got a Oye Cubana thrown at me. And in any case, I was also integrated into those communities by the Caribbeans themselves, so by Dominicans themselves. And as I began interacting more and more with Dominicans, I began to notice that there were several cultural similarities between Dominican practices and those of my West Indian family at home. And so I had grown up in this diasporic enclave where heritage from any West Indian nation kind of made you automatic family. In fact, sometimes we didn't even know. We'd be like, I think they're Jamaican, or I think they're from the Bahamas. Doesn't matter. They're all cousins, right? And so I realized after all of those connections that there was this kind of ideological separation that was happening between what amounted to be Anglo, Dutch, and French Caribbean from that of the Spanish Caribbean. And so I began to ask the questions, what racial and language ideologies allowed for this separation for us to be categorized as Black, West Indian, Caribbean, and them to be categorized as Hispanic or Latino in this kind of mutually exclusive way where they couldn't be both Hispanic and Black at the same time. And so this question of this separation has driven much of my research. And now, of course, that I'm armed with a lot more historical knowledge and experience, my aim is to demystify this separation. And so today, I'm going to address the ways that I'm able to take on this work within the field of linguistics after laying down some like foundational understandings of why I'm calling for political transparency within these calls for decolonizing the field. So, in order to situate these calls for decolonizing linguistics, I want to present two terms of import. The first is hyperracialization, and the second is linguistic justice. So these terms are quite important when considering the study of language because of the inextricable linkages between language and social categorizations, which we've heard a little bit about today. So hyperracialization is a process by which racial characteristics, both physical and social, are ascribed to an individual or a group of individuals with little to no input from those individuals themselves. So these ascriptions allow for the social dominance of one group over another through either direct action or exclusion from societal resources. So hyperracialization is taken up in projects of boundary creation around identity categories as well as around linguistic practices. So terms such as Spanish can become used as racial identifiers in certain contexts. Say, for example, in New York City, if anybody is familiar with this. In New York City, the heterogeneity of Latin American migration resulted in the use of linguistic ability as a determiner of racial identity. So you may see a restaurant that says Spanish food, and they are not talking about food from Spain, they are talking about food from whatever population is in that area. So it may be Colombian, Peruvian, Dominican, right? Or they may say Spanish people be like, and they're not talking about people from Spain, they may be talking about Puerto Ricans or somebody else, right? So this brings us to linguistic justice. So linguistic justice is defined as an action that redresses linguistic racism. So an example of linguistic racism that's particularly relevant to my conversation today is anti-Black linguistic racism. And this has been defined by Dr. April Baker Bell as, and I quote, something that refers to the linguistic violence, persecution, dehumanization, and marginalization that Black language speakers endure when using their language in schools and in everyday practices, end quote. So examples of actions that evidence linguistic racism are abound. For example, if we think about the policies and laws that denied access to literacy for enslaved populations across the Americas in the past, or the denial to literacy in mother tongues today in schools across the United States. If we think about the way that Siri or Hello Google only understands hegemonic varieties of language, or the fact that a new company called, I think it's Sarah or Syra or something like that, is interested in converting people's language to standard varieties when we call them at call centers. So it would be something that you could put on your phone, and if you were calling a call center in India or in the Philippines, it would convert their language to a standard variety of English, right? We can also think about the fact that housing requests over the phone are 3 times more likely to be denied when the voice is attached to a racialized accent. These are but a few moments where linguistic racism impacts racialized communities. And it makes us really come to the fact that if we are invested, if we're interested in equity and justice, then we must attend to the ways that we understand, evaluate, and conceptualize minoritized language and racialized language and language varieties, as well as the communities who are using these languages. So, over the past few years, linguists have begun to take seriously the racist and colonial histories of the field of linguistics. Doctors Ann Charity Hudley, Christine Mallison, and Mary Buckles, 3 prominent US-based linguists, wrote a call towards racial justice in linguistics. And in that call, they challenged current scholars to increase inclusivity while decolonizing the field of linguistics. As a result, several authors, including myself, responded with our own reckonings towards the continued colonial and white supremacist practices within the field. And this eventually resulted in a special issue in Language, which is a premier linguistics journal. Nonetheless, since then, these scholars, including myself, have been singled out within our professional organization with moves that have called our work unscientific, biased, and in the strangest turn of events, even racist. So this turn and these calls calling our work racist have prompted several of us to question the role of language study in our understandings of society, or more appropriately, in our formations of social worlds through language. In my own work in framing a model for political transparency within the field of linguistics, I asked the questions: does linguistics and the field of linguistics exist solely as an academic endeavor, or can it be used to push society towards a more equitable and socially just formation? Furthermore, I asked, what responsibility do we as linguists and language scholars in general have to our own communities, to the communities that we investigate, and to society at large? So I'm going to take a second, hopefully it shows, to show a poem by Afro-Mexican poet Ariana Brown. If you haven't heard of her, you're in for a treat. But you should definitely check her out after this if you haven't. So the poem is called Dear White Girls in My Spanish Class, and I will talk about why I'm showing it afterwards, if this works. Sorry about the cursing.
New shit. New shit! Dear white girls in my Spanish class. I see you. Stumbling so hard you laugh through entire sentences because my ancestors are a punchline and everything that comes out of your mouth is funny. Funny. Guess I'm used to being a joke, a brown body splayed and smoldering at the corner of your lip. I just want to know, when you hold the sacred sound on your tongue, do you feel less holy? Why are you here? I bet you thought this class would be easy, since Spanish is what poor brown people speak, right? Not something you actually have to try to understand, not fancy or sophisticated, not like French, the language you love overpronouncing as if compensating for your basic American whiteness. You are not special. You are the reason my grandmother feared her children would speak with accents. So afraid, she buried her first language in the space between blood and bone because your grandparents wouldn't let her make a home outside her body. Did your ancestors protect you from pain by withholding what they knew of a country before this one? Let me be clear. Spanish was given to my people at the end of a sword, forced in our throats gory, sharpened under the colonizer's constant eye. Each rolled R is a red, wet fingerprint pointing me back to this. Spanish is not my native tongue. English is not my native tongue. The languages I speak are bursting with blood, but they are all I have. I own only my hot mouth, speeding against assimilation's clock and a colonial legacy you won't even try to pronounce. So I'll ask again, why are you here? Do you think my grandmother's accent a sickness? One so volatile, you call yourself gringa at every chance, so I won't make fun of you when you make fun of the way my language sounds to you. Don't you know I had to fight for this? For each scrap of culture I could get my hands on, even if its lineage is as European as yours. My father, a Black American man, is descended from slaves. I'm not sure if you understand what that means. I am descended from slaves. I want to know where I come from, but I can only trace my history in one direction, so I am here in yet another Spanish class, desperately reaching for a language I hope will choose me back someday. What is it like to be a tourist in the halls of my shame? To not be expected to speak better than you do? To visit Mexico and not care that people mistake you for being from somewhere else? How does it feel to take a foreign language for fun? To owe your history nothing.
Wow. So she also has a poem that's entitled Dear Black Kids in my Spanish class. And so I will point out that she is exploring this concept of language throughout her work. But I showed this poem for many reasons. One is because I really like it, and I love the feeling that this poet has when speaking about her relationship with language, a language with its own colonial histories, right? But more importantly, what Ariana Brown's poem shows us is that there is no language without history. There's no language learning, no language contact, no language change, variation. Nothing about our communication is free from the socio-historic contextualizations that it exists in. She ends the poem by saying, quote, "How does it feel to take a foreign language, to owe your history nothing?" End quote. So this is key. When we're thinking about linguistic justice, we must consider the historical context in which a language has been studied, evaluated, and represented. So in linguistics, there's this kind of very clear history of how the study of language has been conducted. And this is especially true when thinking about minority languages. In a very recent discussion on linguistic justice that happened at the Linguistic Society of America, Creole scholar Saliko Komufuene commented, and I quote, "Linguistics as a discipline developed in the Western world, grounded in Western perspectives onto the rest of the world. Most of this took place during the colonial period, with the natives in the colonized world having no voice. To date, linguists from the former colonies are expected to follow traditional Western bias rather than to contribute alternative perspectives, although some of us, including myself, have succeeded in drawing attention to alternative perspectives. However, there are many voices that have been silenced for one reason or another. I think linguistics should work harder at decolonizing the discipline," end quote. So we must consider these comments within the current demographics of the field of linguistics. And in a 2018 report on the demographics of linguistic scholars, it was found that the population of ethnic minorities with advanced degrees in linguistics is so low in the United States that few federal agencies even report these groups. And this is also true in the European and British context that I just looked up this summer and still cannot find any numbers on, right? So this means that although linguists are heavily involved in investigating minority languages, of which takes up the majority of what's happening in the field, they're looking at minority languages, and some would even say in the revival and revitalization efforts of some of these languages, the scholars who participate in this work are rarely members of the group to which this language is either a native or a heritage language or a home language, any of those kinds of things. So the question becomes, what does community integrated scholarship look like? For some scholars, this model has applicable rules to live by, and they help guide the everyday decisions that we must make when we're conducting our research as language scholars. So Dr. Ann Charity Hudley has proposed a rule for liberatory linguistics, in which any published research that you conduct in a community that you do not consider yourself a part of should include an explicit discussion of the inclusion of members from that community in your research process and your efforts to increase the participation of community members at your university, in your department, and in your research area. My own rule takes that even farther and says that you should do this even if you do belong to the group. I also think about triangulating my data, ensuring that at least one person from the community I'm investigating looks at the entirety of my project in the interpretations from question formation to publication. But whether or not one decides to adopt these models, a few truths should help language scholars develop their research ethos, or in other words, their scholarly praxis. So one of the ways we can develop an anti-racist praxis is through the applications of liberatory linguistics. And as my mentor, Ann Charity Hudley says, liberatory linguistics pays homage to a long lineage of scholars who have persistently asked, who is all this linguistic work for? And it gives center intellectual stage to those who have been punished and even ignored for asking the question itself. So to insist on anti-racism and justice in the study of language, in other words, to decolonize the study of language, several steps have been proposed towards practices of liberatory linguistics. Firstly, we need to take a stance on language and race that specifically calls out racism, discrimination, and persecution based on processes of racialization that we see in language practices. Secondly, we can begin to enact anti-racist investigation by centering the language practices of the most marginalized language users. And these, and in colonial frames, which are often global, that would be the practices of Black and Indigenous language users. And this means that we must resist the desire to compare these minority language users to a dominant group as a way to evaluate the progression of the language or to compare it to these monolingual speaking groups often, if we're thinking about bilingualism or these other kinds of things. More importantly, we must consult these communities, even if we feel like we're part of the communities, in the formation of our questions and in how they experience life as a user of that language. And lastly, we must begin to share our work in wide and varied communities. And I'm overjoyed about the ways that social media is allowing for more access, but we need to do better in institutions about making what seems like common knowledge to linguists accessible to a wider public. So as a response to these calls, I developed the notion of political transparency, which simply put is the insistence that all language investigators be explicit in defining their motivations and orientations towards their research questions, methodological approaches, theoretical frames, and ultimately their interpretations. So language researchers must say who they are and why they're engaging in the studies that they're engaging in. In that vein, I present a personal example, drawing on my research that argues for an understanding of Dominican Spanish as a fundamentally Black language practice. By considering my methodology and theoretical frames for investigating questions that concern the actual community under investigation, I'm able to build a praxis of political transparency. First, I'm explicit in noting that the purpose for doing my work and for saying that Dominican language is a Black language practice is to contest colonial power formations, which have positioned Dominican Spanish as deficient, broken, inappropriate, and something that can be remedied through explicit instruction in formal educational context. Instead, I changed my linguistic questions, since questions themselves are not free from social ideology. Instead of asking or comparing Dominican language to other forms of hegemonic Spanishes, for example, comparing something like null versus overt subject expression in Dominican versus Spanish varieties or Argentinian varieties of Spanish. Instead of doing that, I choose to compare the language production of Dominicans to another marginalized group in the production of another colonial language. So in this case, Dominican Spanish as compared to African American English in the context of both participants speaking colonial languages. In addition, I frame my questions around popular calls for recognition of Blackness within Latinidad that have been going on the internet, in mass media, in music, in reggaeton, and all of these kinds of places. And introducing the call of many Black Latinxes to, quote, cancel Latinidad, and I'm thinking in particular of a hashtag movement that was started by an Afro-Zapoteca poet, Alan Perez, who's noted here in this tweet as Migrant Scribble. The question becomes, in what ways do Afro-Latinxes who have been pushed to the margins of pan-ethnic and racial categorizations mobilize Blackness while also maintaining cultural autonomy from the African Americans who have occupied the categorization since its inception in the United States? And this question is primary when considering the necessity for a promotion of this mutual exclusivity in the construction of racialized notions of Latinidad or Hispanicness that's currently being produced in the United States. Further, in taking into account the surge of kind of familial and public re-educations regarding the Black Atlantic and the consistent migration patterns stemming first from the transatlantic slave trade and then the subsequent and persistent forms of imperialism, neoliberalism, and capitalistic control of the global South by Western powers, I ask how Blackness is mobilized outside the frames of hypodescent and mestizaje that organize US and Latin American racial schemas. So I'll take a second to kind of explain these categorizations. Because in order to contend with the shift in these ideological constructions of Blackness and Latinidad in the United States, it's important to recognize both the commonalities and differences between race constructions in these places. So we're always talking about race as a social construction, and this is a kind of idea of how it's constructed differently within these spaces. And I'll talk about why that matters and doesn't matter at a certain point, right? So for hundreds of years, the United States has functioned on this racialized dichotomy of Black and white, what's characterized by what is popularly known as the one-drop rule of hypodescent. And this casts anybody with 1/32nd or more African blood into the category of Black. So if you are mixed, you are Black. This is also the basis for which anybody who has any kind of mixture is pushed out of the category of white and into some other subordinate group, right? So if you have any kind of heritage or ancestry that can be proved in any of the myriad of ways that they can prove that, then you are pushed out of the hegemonic group into the subordinate group. In marked contraposition, in the Dominican Republic and much of Latin America, one drop of European blood casts one out of the racial categorization of Black and into this racialized conception of mixed. And what happens is this creates a kind of tripartite conceptualization of race in which the labels Black, white, and mixed coexist at the same time as authentic forms of categorization. This conceptualization of race that's happening in Latin America is formed in narratives of mestizaje or mixedness that propound Latinidad as the perfect composition of European, African, and indigenous racial mixture. But it's important to note that even in these conceptualizations, these are mutable and ever-changing, both in Latin America as well as in the United States. So as we're seeing more transnational movement between these spaces, we're going to see developments in how people conceptualize these ideas. More importantly, what we see from both of these conceptualizations is that anti-Blackness functions in both of them, right? And so even if we think there are more categories along the hierarchy of racial categorizations, anti-Blackness still is at the center of both of them. So moving towards my research questions, what I do is I investigate public stances towards Blackness as an identity category for Dominican Americans, who are a group of people with a representative population of individuals who would be marked and identified as Black in the United States, even if they themselves do not agree with that categorization. I argue that through an investigation of Dominican literary or digital literacy practices alongside African-American literacy practices, we can come to appreciate the basis for the formation of a new Blackness, one that by taking into consideration these kind of Black ways of being, expand our notions of diaspora, race, and Black language in the Americas. So I know this is a lot of words on the screen, but I'm going to take a bit of time to delve into the theoretical frame that I've constructed in order to make these arguments that there's this kind of Black community of practice, right? And this is based on an understanding of what has been defined in sociolinguistic research as a community of practice. Penny Eckert and Sally McConnell-Genet describe a community of practice as, quote, an aggregate of people who come together around mutual engagement in an endeavor. Ways of doing things, ways of talking, beliefs, value, power relations, and short practices emerge in the course of this mutual endeavor. As a social construct, a community of practice is different from the traditional community, primarily because it's defined simultaneously by its membership and by the practice in which that membership engages, end quote. So this would be, you may have a linguistic community that speaks the same language, and that would be defined as a community. In this case, we're saying that if you engage in similar practices, it doesn't matter if you have different linguistic practices or language varieties, you may still be part of one community of practice, right? So this is what I'm arguing here for. So I argue as well that to understand what I define as a hemispherically Black American community of practice, through an investigation of language, we must take up three theoretical frames. The first is racial-linguistic ideologies, which is this inextricable link between ideas about our language and ideas about race. The second is stance-taking, which is the ability to make language choices, conscious language choices, that index already developed social categorizations. And the third is Black self-determination, which is the process of insisting on Black humanity on your own terms, despite systems which may be built to erase your Blackness. And so for the purposes of the current study, I'm going to just review Black self-determination, because I think that linguists and language scholars in general rarely have the opportunity to integrate cultural study theories into their work. And because I believe that this theory will help us understand the contradictions in the formation of a hemispherically Black American community of practice. So, Black self-determination. Black self-determination takes from Black feminist research. And taking from this Black feminist research, I situate Blackness as an organizing concept of American life. That is, American society, and that is all of the Americas, exists within a hierarchy, one that necessitates the continual reconstruction of white supremacy for the reproduction of all that has been defined as American life. Scholar Saidiya Hartman describes Blackness as a concept that becomes the tool by which white supremacy can claim social capital. She says that this social capital can be traced back to the rules and regulations that structured these societies as slaveholding societies. And this manifests in the ability to enact policies, both legal and social, over its public. So Blackness in the United States and in Latin America is and always was positioned in relation to the dominant, such that allowing Black self-determination becomes a threat to the very existence of whiteness. Moreover, whiteness itself is reliant on Blackness as a way to reimagine, reconstruct, and reinsert itself as the dominant. At the same time, whiteness itself has never been able to successfully stifle moves towards Black self-determination. So taking into consideration the socio-political landscape in which many Black subjects or individuals exist, I argue that Black language practices are a manifestation of Black self-determination. And through an investigation of these practices, we can come to understand what constitutes Blackness and in general, what constitutes race as it's being constructed. I want to take a moment here to say that I use the words hegemonic vernacular English and hegemonic vernacular Spanish to refer to the standardized varieties of English and Spanish across the Americas. For Black English in the United States, there's been this rich tradition of research which has helped many of us come to terms with the fact that African American language is a rule-based and highly creative system that is valid despite years of people calling it deficient or broken version of the European-based hegemonic vernaculars that dominate US institutions. Nonetheless, we still see Black language linked to notions of paucity, depravity, and poverty that are used to maintain the current power structures. So if we see debates about what kind of language can be used in school spaces, or if anybody saw any of the Fox interviews on Cardi B and Meg Thee Stallion's videos on the song WAP, you can see these kind of notions of this Black language being linked to these notions of like depravity. For Dominican Spanish, the research activist tradition is somewhat limited. So much of the research is still based on a comparison with forms that are produced in hegemonic and generally white varieties of the language. And this results in claims that Dominican Spanish is street language, slang, or incomplete versions of Spanish. So taking from this kind of rich research tradition in African American English that I talked about, I use this study to draw parallels between what I call Black language processes or practices that I was talking about, this community of practice. And I use digital productions in Dominican digital spaces, Twitter, Instagram, all of those kinds of places, as well as in African American digital spaces to make these comparisons. And so while several Black language practices have been explored across linguistic literatures, ones having to do with grammatical formations, intonation, and cultural practices of use, for the purposes of this study, I focus on Black lexical processes. In other words, I focus on the ways that Black language users create meaning in their use and mobilization of vocabulary. And there's 5 right there, and I'll go through all of them. So let's start with semantic inversions. Semantic inversions is a process of taking a word and changing its meaning to the opposite of its literal meaning. So this is also a process by which something that was originally given a negative connotation is now given a positive connotation or vice versa. So we can see that in this example of an African American English, which reads, "Yeah, that's my degree," the one that says "bad MFer" on it, end quote. So here I point out the use of the word "bad." which in this case is not used to indicate that this person is bad, but rather that he is the best, which is indicated by the fact that he has a degree and that he's dressed very nicely, if you like that style, right? And this tweet that I came across in my corpora of Dominican memes, it reads, "My boss just came back from the Dominican Republic. I called him El Guapo. It didn't go as planned." So in order to understand the joke, one must have access to the semantic inversion that has taken place in the Dominican Republic, which shifts the meaning of El Guapo from somebody that is handsome or good looking to someone who's very upset or angry. And this particular example is representative of Black language practices which obscure meanings from the general and hegemonic populations. Phonological evolutions also play a large role in the creation of Black vocabulary. And this is a process by which an Africanized or innovative pronunciation of a word results in the lexicalization of that word, or in other words, a new meaning is attached to that word when it's pronounced in a particular way. So one example of this in African-American English is the use of brother and sister as terms of endearment for any community member, regardless of their biological connection to you. And this term, I argue, is uniquely African-American in that it's mobilized in efforts to build solidarity between community members. For this reason, when you hear this term used across racial or community boundaries, it's often censored or met with a prompt, "I'm not your sister," or "I'm not your brother," in the standardized variety of the language as well. Phonological evolutions are also very common in Dominican Spanish. So frequent use of the word tigre were evidenced throughout the Dominican corpus of memes. In this meme, which reads, "Y este tigre?" it's comical for several reasons. First, tigre is a phonological evolution from the word tigre, which means tiger in English. This innovative pronunciation, introducing an additional syllable from tigre to tigre, shifts the meaning of the word from tiger to somebody with street smarts or a number of other more vulgar permutations of that word, which we can get into at another time, right? The next process is double voicing, and this is a process whereby common words are given unique Black meanings. These meanings sometimes enter the mainstream culture. However, for the most part, the Black meanings that the words have been given only have value in the Black community because of the context that are not transferable to the hegemonic community. So in this meme, we see it reads, "All these naps and I still can't sleep." Yeah, the and is cut off, but "and I still can't sleep." And I'll point to the word naps, which in this case does point to a short moment of sleep, which is the hegemonic variety definition of the word. But alongside the picture that's evidenced there, it also means tightly curled hair in African-American English, right? So we get these productions where we have the double voicing of these words. This also happens in Dominican Spanish. And we see this in this meme, which reads, "Deja el corro," or "leave behind your crew," or even more appropriately translated to like, "Don't be worrying about your crew." So coro, the word, means choir in hegemonic varieties of Spanish. But now in this variety of Spanish, it also means a crew or a group of people, right? So choir, which could be just a musical group, is transmutated into something who's just a group of friends, right? African Americans have also been known for their innovative abbreviations. And this is when shortened words of certain versions of words or acronyms take the place of full vocabulary words in spoken and digital productions. So we could have seen that a lot when people were calling the coronavirus Rona, right? The shortening of words for African Americans is not only related to the creation of codes only legible to their community, but it's also connected to finding levity within struggle that's often brought about by the legacies of enslavement in the United States. So in this meme, we see explicit reference to this coding process. In the meme that reads, "Only Black mamas can translate this," followed by a series of letters, which you guys can attempt to translate as I keep on going on, but I will not. So I want to point out that the use of translate in this meme also points to a recognition of these forms of language as legitimate and productive within those communities. And this also exists in Dominican digital artifacts. It was evidenced by the popular and frequent use of the greeting "que lo que," which already went through a process of abbreviation from "que es lo que es" to "que lo que," and then eventually began to be produced as KLK in digital productions. So this greeting is often marked as Dominican slang, meaning what's up. And importantly, we see the incorporation of English orthographic systems, Ks don't usually appear in Spanish orthography, as kind of indicating the construction of a uniquely Dominican American language practice. So this practice of abbreviation can also be seen in shifting of what may be vulgar into something a little bit more colloquial. In the first meme, we see the KLK alongside an abbreviation of MMG, which allows them to say a pretty vulgar word without actually saying it. And in the second one, I'll note that the term chapeadora also applies double voicing. So that changed the verb chapear, which meant to gold plate something, to a noun form, chapeadora, which now functions as the word gold digger in Dominican Spanish. And lastly, Black self-determination is often taken up in one of the most basic and fundamental vocabulary practices, and that's in naming. So in this meme, we see the practice of inventing a name by combining the mother's and father's name in action. We see a tweet that reads, quote, Tyranisha, which is a combination of Tyrone, the father's name, and Keisha, the mother's name. It then says, come on, Black people, stop it. And it's followed by hashtags, hashtag Tyranisha Law, hashtag the baby, and hashtag Black names. And it has a picture of Bobby Brown with the words, wow, really? So we can see that even though this is a practice that's clearly part of the community of practice, there's still these kind of reproaches that are happening to it. This process was also noted in Dominican culture, and it often receives the same kind of reproaches that it does when African Americans engage in the practice. In the post, it says, Dominicans be like, my name is Yudi, and my husband's name is Almauris, so we came up with a unique name for naming our daughter, Yudesque Lauris Maria. It then says, please stop, in big letters. Right? So in her work on the system of Black vocabulary, Geneva Smitherman notes that, quote, although African Americans are linked to Africans on the continent and in the diaspora, the Black American, as late writer James Baldwin once put it, is a unique creation. For one thing, other diasporic Africans claim citizenship in countries that are virtually all Black. Jamaicans, Bajans, Nigerians, Ghanaians, etc., are not minorities in their native lands. For another, not only are Blacks a distinct minority in America, our status as first-class citizen is debatable, even at this late hour of US history, end quote. So while Smitherman's comments focus on Black lexicon in relation to African Americans, I argue that by looking at practices of Black subjects across not only national boundaries, but also linguistic boundaries, we find parallels that evidence a shared experience of Blackness not previously captured in studies on only one language. This experience marks both Dominican and African Americans as part of a singular community of practice bounded by Black language processes that were brought about during processes of enslavement. Calling attention to these practices that are widespread in the Dominican community in relation to these practices that it mirrors in African American English is part and parcel of what we call linguistic justice. In other words, the research itself is an action that redresses linguistic racism. Since both Dominican Spanish and African American English suffer from stigmatization in the wider US and Latin American schemas, we can go back to these questions of how I can claim that Dominican Spanish is a Black language practice, even if people of all races or social categorizations use it in their daily lives. When we go back to that question and we think about this as a community of practice, the answer becomes quite simple. If we remove the ideology that culture, with a big C, culture, is created and maintained by the hegemonic, which is grounded in white supremacist understandings of American society, then we can position these practices in relation to the Afro-historic context that shape every facet of American life. Moreover, in the first Black majority republic in the Americas, the Dominican Republic, it's not in the least bit surprising that Black language practices would be the dominant, if not the hegemonic, language practices. So ultimately, my hope is to provide foundations for the construction of new logics that allow us to contend with the complexities of racial hierarchies through the investigation of language. That is, instead of focusing on how we survive colonial systems of power, how we teach our students to be more like the dominant group, I seek to understand how we transform these systems by refusing to engage within the frames that have been laid out for us. And as researchers, that means methodologically as well as theoretically. In positing Blackness as a central fact, I follow the tradition of many Black feminists drawing the margins of the margins to the center. I ask, what systems are built to eradicate Black language practices? I also ask, in what ways are anti-Black ideologies institutionalized in these efforts? I ask how we as linguists and language scholars continue to push against these systems across a range of activities, institution, and cross-ethnic solidarities. Further, I look to communities in order to understand the ways that activism, linguistic and otherwise, can disrupt the racial hierarchies that have been dominating social institutions across the Americas since colonial times. I question the ways in which language allows for the commodification of Blackness while continuing to relegate Black speakers to the margins. And finally, I argue that linguistic research can be primary in our understanding of race and ethnicity, expanding the scope of what has traditionally constituted linguistic research, while at the same time pushing against the notion that we can deconstruct racial logics within a singular disciplinary field. So I'll end with a quote from Octavia Butler that has been on my mind in terms of continuing my work. Octavia Butler says, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change." I truly believe that we can collectively shape and change the world through change. And I encourage us to be creative in our endeavors to combat anti-Black racism and systems of racial hierarchies that are always shifting in order to continue subjugation of the other. I ask how we can apply our own political praxis to our research context in ways that moves our research beyond just academic endeavors to something that actually changes the world. So thank you all for listening, and I want to acknowledge the reviews and conversations about Dominican language and vocabulary and youth practices that I've had with my mentors, Jacqueline Toribio and Ann Charity Hudley. And I want to also acknowledge my former confidants and students, Chris Pena and Eric Matos, who are Dominicans that are always willing to talk to me about youth culture, language, and all the things having to do with Dominican language. Their knowledge and their willingness to talk through ideas with me is invaluable to my research. And I'll lastly call attention to the poet that I shared earlier, since I believe that we must listen to artists, since they allow us to engage in language in ways that transcend analytical acumen that we gain as scholars. So I put her Patreon and her Venmo account on there if anybody wants to support her.
Thank you so much. We have time for questions or comments.
This might be a silly question, but I'm not a linguist. What interaction or collaboration is there between people like you who do this scholarship and the teaching of English as a second language?
So I would say that lately we've been thinking about more interactions about teaching languages in general, right? So not just ESL, but EFL as well as teaching of what they call foreign languages or world languages. I had mentioned it earlier during Priscilla's conversation, but we've been talking about how we can apply these ideas of drawing the most marginalized to the center in creating our curriculums for teaching these languages, right? And so we can use African-American vernacular English to teach English as a second language, right? And then by doing that, we're able to teach students something that African-Americans have gotten quite good at, which is linguistic dexterity, right? They can style shift and move between varieties quite easily. Now, African-Americans had to do that because of history and capitalism and colonial violence, which meant that in order to survive, they had to be able to speak multiple varieties. But if we integrate these practices into the ways that we teach languages, then the whole experience becomes better for all students, not just those who have kind of marginalized identities. So that's one of the ways that we've been thinking about that, both in English as well as in foreign languages. So when I think about the teaching or bringing the most marginalized into the center for language teaching, I think about how in the United States, there's usually automatic associations with particular languages. So if we think about French, we think about a particular speaker. It's not on purpose, it just happens, right? It's connected to our social understandings of the world. And so just introducing the fact that other kinds of people speak a language already opens your students up to a world more of information that they can gather on their own. Especially today where our students are connected to the internet and connected to gaining information on their own in ways that maybe they weren't previously done. And what this means is we don't need these textbooks anymore. We don't need to use the textbooks that only have certain images and that are written and produced and, again, follow the money, produced by publication companies that have an investment in a certain image of what these languages are, right? So instead of doing that, we are building more open access curriculums for English as a second language, as well as all of these other languages, so that students have access to more varied conceptions of language. I hope that helped.
Thank you so much, Aris. What a I have so many thoughts and so many connections I'm trying to draw between some fields I only barely touch on. So it's so interesting. And I will talk to you later about how I feel that what you do in practice, what you speak, it puts into practice what you're talking about. I really admire the some of the things around disability justice that you're doing in your work that is just there. But I wanted to ask about, you brought up this point at the end about the commodification of Blackness, and I was wondering if some of these language innovations that you're seeing in Dominican, Spanish are taken up or appropriated by other Dominican speakers and also people in the wider Latinidad who don't identify as Black, in the same way that Black English is just like sucked up by the rest of US culture.
Yes. I'm like, I will start by saying yes. So stay tuned for a paper that I have coming out called How the Whites Stole Reggaeton. And it is exactly about this, right? And so there are particular features of Spanish that index Blackness in Latin America that are played up in varieties of music, reggaeton, Latin pop, that are very popular right now. This is super evidenced by the fact that last year, the artist who won Best Black Latin American Artist was a white man. He called himself a white man. He was a white Colombian. His name's J Balvin. And he won this award not because of who he was or the culture that he represented, but rather because he was appropriating and taking up these features, these linguistic features. And so it's definitely what happens, but it's something that I didn't get to talk about, a Black language practice, is just innovation in general and the speediness of innovation. So what happens in Dominican language is that because these things are being taken up by white artists or white identifying artists, then that forces them, in the same way that African Americans, to come up with new language constantly. So they're constantly coming up with new language. And as it becomes more and more commodified, it just happens quicker and quicker. So it's like fueling the market. But yes, definitely.
Other questions or comments?
Yeah, thank you so much, Aris. This
Thank
was
you.
unbelievably brilliant. And I have like hand cramps and 5 pages of notes from like trying to keep up with everything. I also have a teaching question because I'm someone who, among my other roles, sometimes teaches what's usually called composition. We have our own institutional name for it and blah, 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 blah. And one of the ways that I've tried to subvert racial-linguistic ideologies in that teaching is by asking my students in all of their assignments to designate an audience. And so what we do is we say, okay, is this communication going to be effective and successful for that audience? So like, yay, great, go me. But let's be real about the fact that I actually only have competence to analyze, evaluate, or understand certain varieties of English. So I wonder if you could think through with me, maybe us, how not just assignment practices and what you're writing, but how we're grading, evaluating, and thinking about performance in language also has to change.
Yeah. This is something that I talk about all the time, and something that in language courses I've been able to get around by advocating for like task-based assignments, but not the full like task-based methodology, which has been promoted in educational, in like educational circuits. So what this means is that I create a series of assignments that students are not graded on, but have to continue doing until they have some sort of mastery in it. And that means that if I'm asking them to write, I usually also go from the opposite. A lot of times what happens in class is that people are like, take this colloquial thing and then turn it to appropriate for this audience, right? And that becomes dangerous, right? Because then appropriateness as a thing is like, in this space, you can only speak this way. So usually what I do is I have them take academic text and turn them into colloquial or non-standard text in some ways. So this may be as simple as asking them how they would say it to their grandmother or to a 10-year-old cousin, right? It may not be that there's a different class or racial dynamic to that. And then as they're doing this and they come up with several different ways to talk about things, again, building on this linguistic dexterity thing, then I have them do a final kind of portfolio style assignment. And this portfolio style assignment allows me to grade on different aspects, right? So their creativity, the effort that they put into things, as well as any kind of target forms that we may have talked about in the class. I also tell them that there are certain things we're teaching college students usually, right? And so I'm just honest with them, right? At this point, society says that this test means you need to know this thing in this way, right? So we're going to do this for this test and you're going to learn it and you're going to learn it quick so that we can do other fun things and we can learn other ways of speaking, right? And so if that feels uncomfortable to you, then you too have to complain with me, because community activism, it's students asking for curricular changes that usually changes the curriculum. It's not us, right? We've been saying these things for years, right? So getting our students involved in that activism, I think, is a way that we make change.
I have time for at least one more.
Okay.
Well, just to follow up on everybody else's comment, that was really wonderful. Aris, thank you very much. A lot of really interesting ideas, and I think we all have a ton of things to continue talking about. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is in your talk, you were sort of, I guess, one of the ideas that I really liked is the comparison between Dominican Spanish and African American English. I think that's valuable, extremely valuable, and extremely important for people to keep in mind, kind of as we're going through like this point of comparison, right? And that's something that comes through all the time in bilingualism studies. Mm-hmm. And we're moving away from that, thank goodness, in bilingualism studies, where we're no longer, the monolingual ideal sort of thing, right? So that's one thing. I just wanted to say thank you very much for expressing that so very clearly and eloquently, and using it in your own research. And then the other thing is more kind of a question about how sort of your perspective on, I guess the term might even be kind of erasure that happens within the Latino communities here in the United States, whereby everybody's Mexican. And
especially in this area, right?
Right. Yeah. Or yes, exactly. Maybe in New York City, maybe everybody's Puerto Rican, or I don't know what. But it's just this ease of sort of painting everybody with these broad strokes, and the fact that in some situations, yes, like we are all, or rather, those who are would identify as Latino, and it is to our, in some way, benefit to use erasure in some ways, but in other ways it is not. So I was wondering if, say in your work, where you have Dominicans who say self-identify as Black, are there occasions where they don't, and where they might find it beneficial to not, and to sort of play up other aspects of their identity?
I'm going to try to answer this as fast as possible because I know that I'm over time. So there are two different kinds of terminology, racial terminologies that are used in these societies. One is what I call and define in my work as state-sanctioned pan-ethno-racial terminology. These are things, think of like clicking a box on a census, saying who you are for health resources, clicking what you need for a scholarship, things like that, right? And so state-sanctioned pan-ethno-racial terminology often does not capture the experiences of individual people in ways that erases them. Say, for example, my friend over here who is Turkish, who has to mark white on a census box, right? And is clearly not necessarily treated as a white man in the United States. So Dominicans in particular are very good at pushing against these state-sanctioned pan-ethno-racial terms. So in a recent study that I did that compared Dominicans in Madrid to Dominicans in New York City, there was 100% dissension in the terms that they chose to use for themselves. Everybody used Dominican as both an ethnic, as a nationality, and as a racial term. So when I said, where were you born? And they said Spain. And I said, okay, well, what race are you? And they said Dominican. And I was like, okay, well, what nationality are you? And they said Dominican. And I was like, well, you were born in Spain. They were like, you figure it out. I'm Dominican. I was born in my mom's belly and I'm Dominican, right? Like, so they fight against those things. On the other hand, in New York City, 100% of them said that they were Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish because they were saying that they were not Black, and Black was being used as an ethnic term to define African Americans. So they needed to create that separation, even though in a census form, they may click the box Black, right? So people are playing with the ideas of self-identification. So in my own research, what I use is self-identification, ascribed identification, and street race. Street race is the race that the majority of the people in a society would mark you as without you opening your mouth when you're walking down the street, right? Triangulating those concepts of race allows me to have different kinds of interpretations. I hope that helped. We can talk more about it.
Thank you very much. And I think we have a break now, and the next panel starts at 3:15.
Thank you.